Good evening, everyone. Hope everyone's all right. Thank you for coming out tonight. My name is Joe Driscoll. I'm the 5th District Counselor. With us today, we have all my fellow counselors, Counselor Hogan, Counselor Majuk, Counselor Paniagua, Counselor Green, President Hudson, President Pro Temp Counselor Bay, Counselor Rudd, and Counselor Allen. Also joining us, we have Mary Margaret from O'Hara from Neighborhood and Business Development, Brian Baer from CNS Engineering. They're the company that has done this environmental impact study, and Ken Towsley, our Director of Codes. So thank you all again for coming out, and it's great to see the council chambers packed always. I'm a big fan of civic engagement. So basically, I'll give you a brief overview of how things are going to roll tonight. We want to inform you guys about the environmental impact study. So there's two parts. There's the lead ordinance, which is going to be introduced after this period. We have a 30-day public comment period where we want to hear from you and the public, the citizens of Syracuse, get your feedback, thoughts of are you in favor of it, in opposition to it, ways you think we could improve the legislation. We'll be taking time for that after the brief presentation tonight to hear from you. And also you can submit your comments in writing to mbd@syrgov.net. You can submit your comments in writing, and we'd love to take them. And as we take all these comments in, we're going to take the 30 days, March 5th, the public comment period ends. We take all the public feedback that we've gotten, we look at the legislation, and we try to incorporate the input that we've gotten to make the legislation as good as it can be, as strong as it can be, and then we introduce it to the council. So that's what's going on tonight. We're going to be trying to focus, from our perspective, mostly on the environmental impact study and what we've learned from that and what has gone on. So we're going to have about 20, 30 minutes, but probably 30, 40 minutes of presentation from these folks, and then we'll be hearing from the public for the remainder of the evening. We have a sign-up list. If anyone still wants to sign up, there's council staff in the back, and we request that you keep your comments to around 2 to 3 minutes. 2, says Counselor Bay, so 2 minutes from Counselor Bay. I happen to second that motion, so we got 2 minutes. We're all good. So thank you all again for coming out, and with that being said, Brian, are you going to present first? So again, Brian Baer with CNS Company, who have done this environmental impact statement. Thank you for coming, Brian.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Appreciate being here. Thank you very much. Again, my name is Brian Baer, CNS Companies, and as Joe said, the city has retained CNS to assist in the preparation of the draft generic environmental impact statement associated with the proposed lead ordinance. A little background on myself.
Put the mic closer, Brian.
Yeah. A little background about myself. I've been working at CNS in the environmental consulting industry for more than 20 years. Most of what I do involves impact analysis and document preparation associated with the New York State Environmental Quality Review Act, or SEQR. The city, as lead agent for the draft generic environmental impact statement, has undergone a review per SEQR. And let me just back up. SEQR, for those of you who don't know, is the law in New York State which requires local and state agencies to consider environmental impacts associated with actions that they are either going to undertake, fund, or approve. Now, the city, as lead agent, has decided that the proposed lead ordinance is the type of action that may result in significant adverse environmental effects, and therefore have undergone the preparation of this generic environmental impact statement. So what is the DGEIS and what's in ours? So the DGEIS it provides an overall assessment of the proposed lead ordinance's potential effect on the environment. And it also develops standards and mitigating measures to follow for subsequent actions. The city of Syracuse is proposing to amend its municipal property conservation code to provide the identification, reduction, and control of hazards due to the presence of deteriorated lead-based paint in and on pre-1978 structures. The ordinance will require the presence of deteriorated lead-based paint be identified and correctly addressed. The project purpose, need, and benefits. The need for a lead ordinance is based on the significant impact that lead exposure has on its residents, especially children. Onondaga County is one of 15 counties meeting the New York State Department of Health's criteria to be identified as a community of concern, with the city of Syracuse containing 5 high-risk targeted zip codes, serving as the basis for this designation. New York State's policy framework for primary prevention to address lead hazard in housing before children are affected provides limited financial resources. The city of Syracuse and its proposed ordinance will define methods to control lead hazard before exposure occurs. All right, so health effects of lead. What do we know about lead? Well, lead enters the body through either inhalation, absorption, or ingestion. It's absorbed by bones, blood, and tissue, and this leads to continuous contamination exposure. Both short-term and long-term effects of lead are known. Short-term effects are those that generally result from high levels of exposure in a short period of time. Symptoms include fatigue, headaches, memory loss, and tiredness. Or more severe symptoms include anemia, kidney, and brain damage. Now, long-term effects, these are those that result from low exposure over a longer period of time. It can result in nausea, depression, abdominal pain. More severe symptoms can include high blood pressure, heart and kidney disease, and reduced fertility. Children under the age of 6 years old absorb lead 4 to 5 times faster than adults, leading to magnification of contamination effects. Cognitive development can be inhibited. This leads to lifelong harm. Symptoms include altered neuromotor and neurosensory function, hearing loss, learning, and behavioral abnormalities. Physical damages also can occur, including seizures, comas, and immunotoxicity. Damages from lead poisoning in childhood are often irreversible. Okay. So the proposed action. The lead ordinance will authorize inspection by City of Syracuse personnel associated with rental registry and certificate of compliance. Housing units will be exempt if they are already required to be safe from lead paint hazards under federal law, or an EPA certified risk assessor deems the unit has no lead-based paint. Building owners are required to obtain a rental registry certificate for each 1 and 2 family owner-occupied dwelling rented or leased within the city. A lead visual assessment is completed as part of the inspection process. Rental registry certificates expire 3 years, and a lead visual assessment will be completed for each renewal. The city also issues certificates of compliance for 3, 4, and 5 family rental properties. A lead visual assessment will be connected to issuance of certificates of compliance, and these are also renewed on a 3-year period. A visual inspection will also occur as a result of a filing of a complaint. So what does a visual assessment include? Well, it includes a review of deteriorated paint, both interior and exterior, and it also will involve a review to determine whether or not bare soil occurs within the drip line of structures. Within the draft Generic Environmental Impact Statement, or GEIS, there are 2 alternatives that are described. Alternative 1, this involves the identification of a high-risk area. High-risk areas will be subject to additional inspection and clearance requirements as compared to areas outside the designated area. High-risk areas will be based on a number of factors, including but not limited to county health department inspections and elevated blood lead levels observed during New York State mandated testing. Okay. Alternative 2, this alternative excludes designation of a high-risk area and subsequent dust wipe sample clearance protocols. Within the alternatives analysis in the document, Alternative 1 has been selected as the preferred alternative. So the high-risk area. The city has defined within the document high-risk areas as those census tracts that fall within the Neighborhood Revitalization Strategy areas, or NRSA. The NRSA aligns with areas in which high rates of childhood elevated blood levels have occurred. The United States Department of Housing and Urban Development have approved the NRSA, and this area was selected as it results or as it meets or exceeds the following 4 criteria. At least 50% of housing was built prior to 1978. At least 50% of households reside in rental properties. A significant amount of residents are living in poverty. And at least 50% of the area is comprised of residents considered a minority population. Okay, so this slide is going to give you an overview of those structures that will be listed in the rental registry or that will require certificate of compliance. You can see the total number of structures that are built prior to 1978 and built after. It also provides information with respect to the total structures in the NRSA. Okay. So, as previously stated, this document is a draft generic environmental impact statement. We are currently in the public comment period. We have issued this document to the public for comment and input, and we've also provided this document to other state and local involved or interested agencies. The public comment period began February 5th and will end on March 5th of 2020. A copy of the document is provided at the City of Syracuse's Neighborhood and Business Development website. A link is shown in the slide there. And the public can submit comments regarding the DGEIS to the Department of Neighborhood and Business Development, address provided. Comments may be delivered in person, mailed, or submitted by email to mbd@syr.gov or .net. All set. Yep. Thanks. Yeah, that concludes my presentation. Yeah.
That's it?
That's it.
Okay.
Yep.
At this time, I'd like to offer the opportunity for my counselors to ask any questions about the presentation, but I would note to the council that we will have separate meetings regarding the ordinance itself. The questions now would, if we could keep them restricted to the results of the environmental impact study. Councilor Hogan, Councilor Majuk. Iniagua, Green.
Quick one. The area that's chosen in the NRSA, do we know what percentage of the cases typically come from that area?
I do not have that data on hand. I can certainly provide you with that information, but I don't have it on hand right now. Yeah.
Can I call on my experts in the audience? Deb, Stephanie? No?
There's a very close correlation between.
Oh, sorry, Deb, can you come to the mic? Just so everyone knows, I warned Deb beforehand this is probably going to happen. It's Deb Lewis.
I'm Deborah Lewis. I'm the program coordinator for the Onondaga County Health Department Lead Poisoning Prevention Program. The NRSA areas and the areas identified as areas of high risk for potential for lead poisoning in Syracuse and Onondaga County have a very close alignment. The percentages, I don't know that specifically, but when we look at GIS mapping and we layer those two things together, they're identical areas of the city that are also associated with other indicators of social determinants of health like poverty, a higher percentage of rental properties, a higher percentage of households receiving Social Security benefits, and other indicators that indicate that housing and the needs of the families are going to be increased for our community.
Does that answer your question, Councilor Green, relatively? President Hudson, any questions?
Hey, Rob? Yeah.
Question? Good. Okay, thank you, Brian, for your presentation. Mary Margaret, if you'd like to say a little bit. So Mary Margaret is here on behalf of the Neighborhood and Business Development chapter of the city, and she's been heading up a lot of the lead program thus far. So she has a brief presentation on what the city's lead program looks like thus far.
Thank you, Councilor Driscoll. Thank you, Brian. So just a little background, the city received funding from the Housing and Urban Development, the HUD department, for eligible units to receive funding to make houses safer from lead hazards. So I'm going to go through a little bit on what is what the funding is and what qualifies a unit to receive the funding. So the city was awarded $3.5 million. That was the full amount in this grant funding cycle to address lead-based paint hazards, and $600,000 in healthy homes assessment, which is for non-lead-based paint hazards. Could include improvements for mold, trip and fall hazards, and other home health hazards. The grant period began in April, and we will be finishing up before October of 2022. In order for a unit to qualify, first, that we can only work in units between 0 to 4. It has to be built before 1978, and a child under the age of 6 needs to reside in the property or visit and spend a significant amount of time there. And significant is defined at least 2 days a week. It relatively works out to about 60 hours a year. For an owner to be eligible, so that's the first step, is that the unit needs to be eligible. Next, the owner needs to supply the deed, a copy of the current homeowner's insurance policy declarations page, proof that the mortgage is current, and sign and fill out their part of the application. The resident needs to bring income documentation, which includes all sources of income. So it could be anything from a COLA letter to employment, pension, retirement, any public assistance, rental income, etc. So a lot of that is the financial portion that the resident needs to bring, and it's important to distinguish that the homeowner doesn't need to bring any kind of financial documentation. All of that is just for resident eligibility for all residents over the age of 18, unless they're a full-time student. We also do need a blood level test for any child under the age of 6 that actually lives there. If they do not live there and are just visiting, then we do not need the blood test. We coordinate with the county health department. They receive part of our grant to administer a portion, which also not only helps us to identify areas where children are most at risk. So if the health department receives information on a child's elevated blood lead level, they enter it into our IPS database, which is the database that CODES uses to track properties with CODES violations. At that point, our office sends out a letter to the unit encouraging them to apply for the program. Once an application is received and approved with all the documentation, the resident receives notification, and a lead inspection risk assessment is performed with an XRF machine, which is able to identify lead hazards on all painted surfaces. At that point, the risk assessment report will recommend either, depending on the level of lead found and the component that it was found on, whether it needs to be cleaned, replaced, fixed, repaired, painted. All of that is based on a scientific study. So the last part is actually performing the work at the unit, and all of the areas that are treated will be where lead hazards have been identified, whether it be the interior or the exterior of the property, which can include doors, floors, porches, windows. Those are the most common areas. The health department also does outreach to the residents to provide education and safety on how to safely protect themselves during, before the preparation, when the work is being prepared, during, and then after, on how to safely clean and protect themselves and their belongings and their family. So if you'd like to apply to the program, we do have the applications on the back table tonight. There's also some flyers out, and you can go to the city's website, www.syrgov.net/lead. You can call the lead program line, which is 315-448-8710. You can ask that an application be sent to your residence. You can email. And you can also pick up an application at the Department of Neighborhood and Business Development, which is next door at City Hall Commons on the 6th floor.
Great. Is that the end of your presentation?
Yes, that's
All
it.
right.
Thank you.
So now I'd like to open up to my fellow counselors. Does anyone have any questions?
Well, I was just wondering, as far as reaching out, what does reaching out mean? Door to door?
The health department, their outreach is for the units that have been approved and where the lead inspections have been performed, and we're waiting for the contractors to go in to do, they'll be disturbing a lot of dust and paint at the property. So the health educators come before that happens to help the family protect themselves and their belongings. So whether it's covering with plastic couches and mattresses in certain areas, and enclosing rooms that are being worked on, safety measures that need to be taken into account while the work is being performed.
I guess my concern is how we let people know in the neighborhood know about the programs, folks that don't have computers, things like that.
About the lead program. Yeah, so we do a lot of public meetings. We've done an outreach in the TNT for the past 12 months into that community. A lot of it is word of mouth, neighbor to neighbor. A lot of the folks that are being affected are in the rental community, so they don't always attend some of the neighborhood meetings, which is a tough call. And sometimes we get them, unfortunately, when the children have already been affected, when we're notified over a high blood lead level. Yeah.
Deb, you'd like to say something? You can come back up to the mic again. And Councilor Hogan, I'd also like to mention that we've been speaking with SU about incorporating a few students to help with getting the word out in the neighborhoods and doing outreach to both property owners, landlords, and tenants who face the problem as well. That's one aspect we're working on. Deb?
The Onondaga County Health Department Lead Poisoning Prevention Program scope of services includes proactive promotion of the program to include social media, marketing, development of materials, distribution of materials. Information on the grants go out in every notice and demand that is sent out by our office for all of our inspected units. And when Mary Margaret referred to inspection information being entered into the city's codes database, IPS, there is a mechanism within that for the health department to make a directed referral to the lead program based on the condition of the property and the owner's interest or need for the grant program.
Is this outreach language appropriate when you make an appointment to go visit a unit? I mean, there may be
If
people there that...
translation services are required, that's a part of our required service to the community, is to make sure that that accommodation is provided.
Okay.
I'm also a Spanish speaker, and so whenever I receive phone calls, I'm able to help people with the application.
Else? Councilor Green and Peniagua, any more questions? Joel?
I have one more question. From when you submit your application, how long is the process to get approved?
Well, the most important thing is getting all the documentation in, and it is quite cumbersome because the income documentation, people don't realize that it requires all sources of income. So sometimes people bring pay stubs, but then they also have maybe pension income or Social Security income, and we have to make sure that everything's brought. The next is that the blood test has to be current. So the requirements are quite steep, but I would say if we have all of the documentation in on an application, we then are able to approve it, and the county lead inspectors, within about 1 month at least, usually it's a lot less, between 2 weeks to a month, will have contacted the residents and the owners to make an appointment to do the inspections. Next, we have to have the XRF machine inspection as well. That's very shortly after, usually within days. It actually could be before or after those inspections. Then the risk assessment report is prepared. And at that point, the county has a list of 16 EPA-approved contractors that have 2 weeks to bid on the contract, and then they have 2 weeks after that to start work. So, if we have an approved application, it may take 2 months, depending also the backlog of then to actually hammer some nails and start work.
And just one point I'd like to make quickly is that the burden of information is quite heavy, but all of that is federally regulated, so that's not, as far as the amount of pay stubs and, we've had some pushback from people saying that there's a lot of paperwork required, but that's federally mandated that we have to. So, Councilor,
Just on that one, because that was my question. You're saying that all of the resident requirements are federally mandated?
Yeah, we've tried to take away some burdens. So on this iteration of our lead program, for example, we took away, there used to be a lien placed on the property once work was performed, a 5-year, decreasing lien. But all of the requirements listed in here are federally
You say
required.
push back. How do you push back on certain things? Are there other ways? Because in particular, I don't believe we typically spend all the county lead money. And I do think the resident eligibility requirements are probably the biggest.
So this is not county money, this is city money.
It's city HUD money.
Right.
We're targeting an area where there's high poverty. So you're saying if you confirm that this house is in the neighborhood that's got high poverty and there's kids in the house and there's lead hazards, that you're going to force those people to go get proof of income, proof of assets, and all these other things in order to get into the property that they don't own?
Right, so we don't,
Have the repairs done?
the program is open to, just to clarify, it's not exclusive only to the NRSA, it's open to the whole city, as long as they meet the eligibility requirements. If, yes, the tenant, regardless if they live in the NRSA or not.
Would it be possible to remove the some of these resident eligibility requirements within the NSR, the neighborhood strategic?
I wish we could, but this is a HUD required, because it's income based for the tenant. They have to, they can't make more than 80% of the area median income. So that's why they need all of sources of documentation on
I think we
financials.
should push back and ask them to, if within the area, if we're saying we're making a lead law that's going to primarily apply in this area because the lead poisoning results overlap with the poverty levels that go with this neighborhood, why wouldn't you want to just fix the unit? Because someone else is going to move in there when these people move.
I think that's a really great point because essentially this is about not only helping children to not get lead poisoned, but it's also creating safe and healthy housing because there is turnover and there's a lot of turnover in certain areas. The one thing that having to provide all sources of income assures is that we are targeting units where the residents make no more than 80% of the area median income.
Just point of clarification. It's a lot of information, and I think this will probably be good for the public as well. There appears to be, and I put the quotes on appear, conflicting, or at least on the surface, what seems to be conflicting statements, right? Under Section 1.1, Purpose, Need, and Benefit, New York State Policy Framework for Primary Prevention Rate of Lead Exposure, New York Policy Framework for Primary Prevention to Address Lead Hazards in Housing Before Children Are Affected provides limited financial resources. Obviously a point of concern just in general, but I mentioned that because obviously in another part of this, it talks about prevention as a goal, and prevention makes sense. But I want to make sure I'm not reading anything wrong. Where I look at units with county health department lead violation, what determines, the county has to first determine that there's a kid infected with lead poisoning before they receive?
No, that's just one of our strategies for targeting, helping to reach where We have, in the presentation, it just shows a partnership we have with the health department. They provide us also referrals for units where a child has an elevated blood lead level so that we can try to address that as soon as possible.
Right, and so to the point of Brian's presentation, so we're only talking about how the designation was acquired when you talk about, because on the surface it looks as if
It's kind of worded as if it was a prerequisite.
right, that you have to find a kid who's infected.
Oh, not at all. No, this is-
So we need to make sure that's clear.
Yes, this is not at all a requirement.
Yeah, it reads.
The presentation could use some work. The application that's in the back, and I can send you a copy, makes it pretty clear that that's not a requirement. Even we require for resident children under the age 6 to have a blood lead level test. If the blood lead level test comes back less than 2, which is essentially possibly 0, that doesn't prevent us from working in that unit.
Why would you do it then?
Because to your point earlier, there may be turnover in the future where there could be another child exposed. Because children are only exposed at their places of residence.
Why would you require a blood level test if a low level doesn't exclude you from the program?
It's
Because
a HUD
people-
requirement. I believe it may have something to do with tracking data based on, how many units have we actually gone into where children have been affected.
I think we should present it to HUD as a barrier because that's all it is if it's not a requirement and it's a barrier and we don't spend all our money.
Deb, you had one.
If I can
point.
clarify 2 points. The HUD requirement for blood lead testing has 2 purposes. They require proof of testing before and after the work is completed to make sure that the children are not inadvertently exposed during the renovation process. So that's really important because improper work practices are the saddest kind of exposure for children in our community. If somebody's doing work that exposes a child in the effort of trying to make a unit safer, that's completely preventable. And so that's kind of a check on the system to make sure the contractors are doing the right thing the right way. And it is a federal requirement. It's been in HUD regulation for a very long time.
That sounds like a good answer initially, but let's just pretend that that happened. Isn't it very unlikely that anything would happen to that contractor because the child could have been exposed in any number of other environments where the child goes?
I can't speak to the regulatory impact of that. That's really outside of HUD, and EPA have regulatory authority over what happens with a contractor that doesn't follow the proper procedure. And there are sanctions that can be incredibly costly to that contractor if they're reported. As far as primary prevention goes, the New York State Primary Prevention Grant Program identifies 15 communities of concern. So where you see the language in the beginning that talks about the 15 counties with primary prevention designations, that's a New York State Department of Health designation that provides grant funding to 15 counties in New York State. And the funding for primary prevention in each of those counties are used for a couple of things: to identify units before children are impacted, form partnerships to initiate a primary prevention approach to the community, and a whole list of other things, develop a lead-safe workforce, and promote strategies that are effective at preventing childhood lead poisoning, such as ordinances at the local level, such as partnerships and referral processes to make sure that properties are maintained and kept safe and healthy for all residents in the community.
Thank you, Deb. And if my fellow counselors don't have any objections, I'd like to have Councilor Majuk address his question. Does anybody else have any questions after that?
I have a question.
All right, Councilor Majuk first, and then Councilor Allen, then Councilor Hudson.
Mayor Margaret, I know that in time that have passed, you have tried to make an effort to go out there and present and do those things. Now, my question is more of a logistic question. And it touches a little bit of what Councilor Beniagua asked earlier. It's in regards to those that have very limited access to information, such as the New American community. Are we very intentional in terms of not just making presentation in the community, but being very intentional as to who are the audience? For example, the New American community, who usually don't go into public meetings, and seniors who are not able to make it out. Are we intentional about those things and how we make sure that they have access to that kind of information.
Yes, thank you very much for that. We aren't as equipped to be as intentional as we'd like to be. We do have the support of the health department in a lot of their activities going out into communities, but it is true, we really could use material in several different languages, not only the application, but on our website. And that's an area that the program could really improve on. So I really appreciate your concern.
And if I could follow up, Councilman Majuk, I think a hope is as we start the enforcement and inspection, we'll start to trigger some more landlords who are perhaps not as proactive in the past to become proactive as they start to see that we're checking. That would be a hope, aspiration. Mm-hmm. Councilor Allen, you had one, and then
yeah, I have two questions actually. First, do you guys have any numbers to date of how many families you've helped since, what was it, April 2019?
So we have 65 cases assigned currently, and about there's several others that are assigned, means that they have the inspection date and they've either had the inspection done already, but there's several others that are coming online to also go under that. We're about 76.
Okay, so do you know, I'm assuming that the number is going to be different. Do you know how many actually applied?
Yeah, so the actual applications, we have several in process that we do a lot of outreach to try to get material from, and unfortunately there's about 70 who we haven't been able to move forward yet.
Okay, and so not move forward, meaning you guys don't have the capacity, or because they don't meet the eligibility requirements?
It is a capacity issue, as well as sometimes what happens is that we'll get many pieces of the application, but perhaps the homeowner's insurance is expired, and we contact the owner, and the owner just doesn't get back to us, or perhaps the resident has left that unit already, and so that would be an application that had been started and in progress but now has stopped.
Okay, and so for the ones that won't meet the requirements, do you guys offer any other resources, or you kind of steer them in another direction? How does that work if you don't meet the requirements?
Yes, so Home Headquarters has a great windows and doors program, thanks to the Community Foundation, some funding. So if they don't meet the requirements, sometimes it's because they don't have a child under the age of 6 who resides there or visits there. So we do let them know about other sources of funding in the community.
Okay, thank you.
President Hudson?
Yeah, I want to try to wrap my head around this. So what I'm hearing you say is that the owner and the tenant are looped together in this process, right? So if there's lead involved and the tenant is being affected, but the homeowner doesn't give you all the paperwork, the tenant's still getting screwed.
Yes, that's correct.
Oh, that don't sound right with me, but anyway, okay, so that's one. So what I want to know is the timeline. So once the work is approved, is started, what's the timeline for the work to be done, approved and done?
Well, as I spoke a little bit earlier
That's the application process. I'm talking about the work.
Yeah, I tried to include the work getting started process in that. So if we have an approved application, it needs to be set up with the inspector, and between the inspector and because the tenant needs to be present to allow the inspector to come in. So they choose a date. Usually it's about 2 weeks out. After that, there's a few days later, usually there's the XRF EcoSpect comes and does their part of the inspection. The risk assessment report is, which includes the recommendations of what type of work to address the identified lead hazards needs to be done at the property. And at that point, there's a bidding process that it takes 2 weeks as well. And then there's, of course, our contractors have to go through their, set up the job. They need to purchase materials. They need to make sure that they're ready to onboard. So it's about a 2-month process before work starts.
Okay, so next question I have is going to piggyback off Councilor Hogan. When you talked about preparing the people, getting the cover of the furniture, and, so what happens to the people? Are they stuck in there? Do we not have a mechanism to move them out of the way so that they're not in the midst of all of this?
So we do have relocation. There is a part of the grant that we've set aside for when it is necessary to relocate. Relocation is a last resort option because there's children at the property usually living there, and to disturb their daily routine, whether it be school or other, is not always the best option. So we really rely heavily on our sub-grantee, the health department, with the relocation process and determining whether this is a case that needs relocation or does not need the relocation.
How many relocation cases have we had so far?
So far, we've had 0.
Okay, one more, I believe, from Councilor Majuk, and then if we could move on. I definitely want to give the public a chance to give us some input before it goes on too long. Did you have one more, Hogan? Okay. Okay, go ahead, Councilor Majuk, and then
Thank
Councilor
you.
Hogan. And
Thank
Councilor
you.
Bay.
Now, I have a question that is it's somewhat two-part, and one is going to Ken. Considering that part of making this process effective is having the court enforcers, right? Now, with this coming on, does that mean that we are going to specifically designate court enforcement folks specifically for this, or is it just going to be a part of a normal process? Because she did say about how this process could a little bit be prolonged in some sense. You got what I'm asking though?
Yes, Counselor. This will be part of the normal inspection process, like we would go in and inspect a leaking faucet, no smoke detector, et cetera. Part of that process when we're in there will be testing for lead through the dust wipes.
Now, part of what the city has been struggling for a long time is not having enough court enforcers, right? Did I get that right? Right? We don't have enough. Right?
Correct.
And if you add this on top of that, not having enough already, is there a part on your part, Mayor Margaret, where we have some funding where we bring on new court enforcers, or how do we do this?
So the way that this grant, this is a 42-month grant, and the way that it was written and devised is that we're not relying on city code inspectors to do the inspections where the HUD grant money is going. We subgranted out that work to the County Community Development Division, and their codes inspectors are the inspectors for the HUD grant and the eligible units. Ken's department and the codes referrals, once they find lead in a unit under the ordinance, if that comes online, they will be able to identify with greater speed and frequency a unit that has a lead hazard, and they can make referrals to get the unit if they're eligible, some funding to address those lead hazards. But the codes inspectors are completely separate on this grant. If in the future the city decides to reapply to HUD funding for another grant cycle, that could be an area that could be talked about using city codes inspectors, or perhaps expanding the program and being perhaps an efficient way within the lead and code side.
And we are pretty much confident that, considering these code enforcers are going to be coming from the county, that we are going to get what we need, as we know that lead is a problem? Are we gonna get what we need?
Yes, fortunately, we work very well with the County Community Development Division. They have 8 inspectors on staff dedicated to this lead grant. And also they run simultaneously the same lead grant program, and these inspectors are used for the city lead grant and the county lead grant.
If we could keep them quick, Councilor Hogan and Councilor Bay, just
I'm not gonna-
one last quick one, because we definitely are over time for the council portion. I'd love to get to the
I
public.
was just wondering, any kind of collaborative effort between the county health department, the school district. I see Mary Margaret's mother, Ann, who's a longtime school nurse, and if a kid exhibits problems, lead symptoms, I'm just wondering if there's any way they trace it back to I worry about identifying all the houses that might be, have this problem. So is there any kind of...
A couple of things. So, yes, the health department collaborates with a number of different partners, and we're frequently interacting with schools, medical providers, agencies, code enforcement officers, risk assessors from the County Community Development Division, and other folks in this room, Legal Services of Central New York. So, yes, we do collaborate with the school districts. The schools also have school-based health clinics, and in some cases where we have difficulties with a child accessing health care through their primary care provider, we're able to coordinate and connect the dots so that the family gets a test done at the school. I think your question sounds like it's going toward if a child is showing that they have had a negative impact from early exposure to lead, what are we doing in the school district?
Well, it's sort of where it came from.
Where it came from.
Is there any way of if the kid comes from a house that's contaminated with lead, is that somehow goes into this effort?
One of the things that school nurses have available to them is access to the New York State Department of Health Immunization Registry, and so they can see whether a child has had a previous lead test. They can also see whether that test has been elevated and requires follow-up services. So in that way, they can kind of get a sense of whether or not the child might need some evaluation, if they're showing some difficulties in behavior or in learning at school. This is a law that was passed a couple of years ago, and the State Health Department granted access to school nurses to look that information up. Essentially, when a child is in school and they're struggling, the process for evaluating that student's needs is the same as it is for any other child. And part of the investigation and the inquiry into what's going on is to look at the child's health history. So we hear from school districts all the time to look for the information. And often, yes, we have been at the house before. Would we then go back to the house and inspect? It depends on the child's test result at the time.
I don't know the address of that house to Mr. Towsley somehow, so we would know that maybe needs to be inspected. Is there some sort of way to do that?
There is an existing way to do that. And one thing I want to clarify is that inspectors are different. And we're talking about inspectors kind of in a lump. Relocation is also different, and we're talking about that kind of in a lump. The health department inspectors are EPA risk assessors. So are the grant inspectors, EPA risk assessors. They do look at lead differently. The health department is looking for intact versus non-intact paint, and risk assessors for a grant look at every painted surface. So what we look at is different and for different reasons because of who pays the bills and what regulations we're working under. When the health department identifies a property that has lead-based paint hazards, one of the things that we're doing in a new partnership with the city is entering that inspection information into the city's codes database. They know when we go in and do an inspection. The information is there. And if there is a case in the home where the family is struggling to make repairs, there might be other things happening in the house like coexisting code enforcement issues, which is often the case. We'll make a direct referral to Ken and his team for a joint code inspection, or to Mary Margaret to send out and initiate the lead application if the family's interested.
Okay, that's good.
Good. Okay, so one last question from Councilor Bay, and then we'll open it up to the public, if that works for everyone. And a reminder to my fellow councilors and to everyone in the chamber, this is definitely the first meeting about lead. We will have another meeting later on to discuss the ordinance itself. As we said, we take all your feedback and incorporate it into the legislation to the best of our ability. But Councilor Bay.
All right, Councilor Driscoll, you took longer than I will. I don't know if an answer could be provided here. I was looking at the summary of potential impacts and the summary of mitigation measures. This is relative to historically protected sites, and this is for efforts to improve. I'll go back 10 years. Ashley Arms on South Salina Street was owned by Southeast Gateway, had lead paint on the outside. They were required, after weatherization, to paint it, and they were obligated to find the color which nobody made anymore. The time it took them to find the paint, the cost it took them to actually get it made would probably be irritating to most developers. And so I'm just wondering, because it says relative to historic and cultural archaeological resources, no impact, but it doesn't mention paint color, which was an issue then. I don't know if the rules have changed since. Maybe that's something we can look into and get a response, just for the sake of information.
The State Historic Preservation Office is a interested agency with respect to the environmental impact statement, and so they are reviewing this document, and so we'll see what kind of feedback we get from them. But as it stands right now, the document suggests that impacts to historic resources will be dealt with as part of the typical zoning, permitting, and so forth done by the city. So.
I'm sorry, but I have one really quick comment. But because I really do believe the eligibility requirements on the residents are out of hand, and just for one, like federal government allowing a similar situation, if you're in a school that's got a high rate of poverty, when you cross a certain threshold, they stop asking everybody to prove that they're poor to get free lunch, and they make the whole school eligible for free lunch, and it's just easier. That's the way this neighborhood thing should be. If you're in this neighborhood zone where we have all this data that you're highly at risk, we should make it easier, because the barriers right now make it seem more like people want to say they have money for it without spending any money on it, instead of actually spending the money. Like, if we make it easier for people to get through, then we can prioritize those with the highest need. And that's easier than having these barriers that prevent us from spending all our money every year.
I think that's a great point. Perhaps you could help me draft a letter and we can present that to HUD.
Good. Yeah, a resolution to HUD would be great. All right. I don't want to cut any counselors off, but if there's no objections, I'd like to open the floor to the public.
I got one quickie. It's
all right.
I just have to ask. I just have to. And this is just, I'm being devil's advocate, okay? Because we know a lot of the buildings that we have in our city are old, okay? A lot of the different tracks that you're talking about, they're old, okay? So when we talk about, and I just want to clear this up in my head, if I don't ask it, I'm going to have a fit. So we're saying that the lead is coming from housing that we identified, okay? Could the lead be coming from the school? Do we know that?
That's the $1 million question. Perhaps the child was infected at a daycare or an aunt's house, or we don't know.
Yeah, and that remains a challenge that I don't know if we have a great answer for it. Yep. Deputy Mayor Owens.
Just when Ben Carson was in town, so this is a federal statute. So when he was in town, both Stephanie and the mayor said directly to him, to the points that you're making about how burdensome it is for us to be able to get this money to the people that need it. So, I mean, seriously, Mary Margaret suggested it. This is a federal statute. We want to be in line with the federal requirements because we lost this grant before and then we got it back. Yeah. So we want to be in line with those, but I think these are points that can be made as a community to HUD through our congressional advocate, our congressional appointees. But we made that point directly to Ben Carson himself, and I think we continue to double down on that, to the councilor's point.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. All right, if there's no further burning questions, we're okay? Councilors? All right. Thank you to our presenters. Thank you, Brian, Mary Margaret.
Can I clarify your school question?
Deb Lewis.
Really quickly.
Let the public speak.
I'm almost done. So, in the case of a lead investigation where a child has been exposed to lead, one of the responsibilities of the health department inspectors is to identify any and all potential sources. So they do ask about other properties the child is associated with, including schools, daycares, playgrounds. We sometimes are called to inspect very interesting places. So part of the investigation is where else is this child going and where is the lead coming from.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Thank you, Mary Margaret. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Ken Towsley. I want to give a special shout out to Stephanie Pasquale, who has worked with us so closely on this, and unfortunately she's no longer with the city, but she was definitely a quarterback on this for a long time, so I just wanted to acknowledge her presence here and give her a lot of gratitude for her hard work on this effort. First hearing from the public, Jamie Howley and Palmer Harvey. And again, we'd ask that people try to keep their comments to 2 minutes, though we know people are passionate.
Hi, I'm Jamie Howley. Palmer and I are co-chairs of TNT Southside, the Housing Task Force. The first thing that I want to talk about is the fact that no one has mentioned that New York State, in October of 2019, lowered the acceptable blood lead level from 10 to 5. That means that under this new lead level, more children in Syracuse will be identified with lead poisoning. More children in the school will require special services. There'll be more work for Deb Lewis as well, and for the inspectors. That's a very important issue to raise. When you look at what's going on in Flint, Michigan, and we may not be in exactly the same situation, but recently I've been reading about the problems that they're having there. They don't have enough staff in the schools to handle the number of children in need. These are very serious questions that need to be included. And because of that, childhood lead poisoning in Syracuse is a very serious issue. And I want to urge the strongest measure you can pass to protect the children.
And seniors.
Well, and seniors too. The lead ordinance is really essential. And so it's also a moral question and a social justice issue. We must protect the youngest, most vulnerable citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Would you like to say some words as well?
Yes. I wear two hats. I'm also the co-founder of Syracuse Tenants Union, and I have a little problem. Some of all the stuff is internal that you guys are checking for. I have more of a question because I noticed like a lot of apartments have exterior problems with lead on the outside. So if things being tested on the outside, or what's another question here? Why are we not doing it before, like as part of an inspection for you, in order for you to have rental property in general? It should be an inspection before this, because it seems like everything we're talking about today is reactionary and not preventative, and that's a huge problem. Because I've met so many tenants whose mothers who are crying to me about their children being lead poisoned, and it's not stopping. They've gone through the process that you guys have talked about, and it's arduous task on the parents of all the things that's happening to their children. So has anything been thought of in that way to more preventative measures than anything else? I mean, yeah, informational thing is good for parents to know, like what we do as part of the TNT Southside Housing Task Force through the block party every year to educate tenants in the neighborhood. But I think it's a huge problem that we're not doing more as educating landlords themselves of the importance of why to really take it seriously, because next steps that are coming down the road is a lot of people are thinking about basically suing landlords for the amount of care and medical costs it's going to take for those children after they've been lead poisoned by a house. They should have took more thought into what they're doing to the public. Well, thank you. Just think about that.
Thank you, Palmer. Appreciate it. I wouldn't want to have questions posed without you guys giving, you can give her a round of applause. Okay. Thank you. I don't want to mispronounce this name. Jeanette Zockler? Did I get that nearly right? Zokler?
Hi, I'm Jeanette Zeckler.
Zeckler, there you go. Sorry about that.
So thank you everyone for paying attention to lead and children in this community. I work for SUNY Upstate. I'm trained in public health. My expertise, though, is really more around the workers' health and how the workers are affected who go in and abate lead. But I come to you also as a mother today because I was a mother raising children in the city with a child with elevated lead. And so I sort of have some training, but I also have sort of a close heart to it as well. And just a quick pass over the ordinance, I definitely go with alternative 1, which has more strict standards And I think that, we have been lowering the lead levels in children in this nation, and I hate to see Syracuse missing out again on the best of what we can do. And I want to see this lead ordinance brought up to the standards that the EPA and HUD have while removing those barriers so eloquently brought out tonight. That's what we see over and over again in the community. There's an opportunity for some change. It's really secondary prevention. Some kids are already affected when these matters are going on. When we know that these houses, many of them, almost entire neighborhoods really need the attention. So while I commend this, I really do think that in this comment period, this body should accept some more expertise to look over. And if I can find just quickly that, we really need to have this more stringent standard of 100 micrograms per square feet for the window trough, that's where kids play, that's where kids are. So we have to be very practical about this and come up with some penalties for landlords who don't comply, when they have this ability to just quickly get out of it. Those loopholes need to be closed. And if you want to look to some people who have done this, in Utica, New York, blood lead levels were lowered and children's IQ points were raised, and also in Rochester. So there's no reason that Syracuse can't do this. And so I thank you for your time and energies on it. I look for greater collaboration between the Department of Health and other bodies that I could name here. So we should work a little more, but work quickly, because there just isn't time.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. Those comments are appreciated. One quick point. I'd like to remind everyone that we do have a stenographer here tonight that the council has, so that we can record all your comments and commit them to record. But I would encourage you all, if you have written comments, to email them to us as well at mbd@syrgov.net. What's that? Oh, yes. And when you come up, please give your name and some information. The next person signed up is Jesse Harasta. Yeah, your name and where you're from, I believe.
Yes, my name is Jesse Harasta. I've lived in the city of Syracuse on the east side for the last 14 years as both a homeowner and a renter. Raised my son, graduated from Nottingham a few years back. Yeah, Bulldogs. But I'm here more today in professional capacity because I'm also a professor of social science at Cazenovia College. And for the last 2 years, I've been interested in exploring the lead question here in Syracuse. Last semester, I took a group of my students, a couple of them are back in the corner there, and we had a team that went around to highly impacted and low impacted neighborhoods in order to try and test the questions about exactly what is it in the social context of high impacted neighborhoods that's leading to greater amounts of poisoning, and that's not present in similar neighborhoods with low impact. We tested 7 different factors, and we looked at 11 different variables. We went house to house, visiting 349 houses across 4 census tracts. And during that time, we came actually as the statistic, and I will say the study's not completely done. We're in the middle of analysis right now. But the preliminary data that I want to bring to you today here is that the most significant factor that we found between high impacted and low impacted neighborhoods was peeling paint on the exteriors of buildings. The chart I have here shows on the left-hand side high neighborhoods with high incidence of lead poisoning, and on the right-hand side neighborhoods with low incidence of lead poisoning. And then prevalence of peeling paint, you can see that the blue bar is no peeling paint and the orange bar is high peeling paint. You can see that the neighborhoods with high incidence of lead poisoning have significant levels of peeling paint, and those with low incidence of lead poisoning have the contrast, very low levels of peeling paint. This demonstrates that if the city wishes to intervene, and questions that have been raised about schools and other settings are certainly important, but from what we can see, the first point of easiest intervention is to stabilize paint in the buildings. One other piece that's been emerging in our research is we've been doing some archival research into what's been studied in Syracuse's research into lead poisoning in the historic sense. I have here maps of elevated blood lead levels from 1998. This is a 10-year study that was done by Griffith. What we can see, and I've highlighted the neighborhoods, is that the neighborhoods that are today being discussed as high-risk neighborhoods were seen as historical neighborhoods for high risk in 1998. 22 years ago, researchers identified those places as being problematic. They continue to be so today. I think that this reinforces the fact that if we want to intervene to stop lead poisoning, we need to take a special microgeographical approach where we're looking at specific neighborhoods and improve alternative one. Thank you for your time.
Thank you kindly, Mr. Harrison. All right, thank you very much. Our next speaker, Oceana Fair.
Good evening, council members.
Good evening.
My name is Oceana Fair. I have a home on the south side of Syracuse that I first rented and then bought from the Syracuse Land Bank. I am also a member of Families for Lead Freedom Now. I am the Southside branch leader. I did not think that 38 years later I would be standing before you still talking about lead poisoning. Lead poisoning has now become generational for my family. I still take care of a 40-year-old brother who suffered severe lead poisoning on the south side of Syracuse. And now, 38 years later, I found out that my granddaughter was lead poisoned from my own home. We have to be better. We have to do better. Looking over the draft ordinance that you guys have out, the outdated dust wipe sampling clearance levels, the ones that are listed in the ordinance have been updated in January by HUD. So we need the language to be strong in this ordinance. We need that new information to be added to the ordinance. Families for Lead Freedom Now would prefer that you pass alternative 1 of the ordinance. My other question to present to this body is, how do we plan to enforce compliance with this ordinance or enforce the inspections since compliance with the rental registry is so low? How do we plan to get this across? This is important. Our children are suffering. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Fair. Really appreciate that. The next speaker is Charlene Fair.
Hi, I'm Charlene Fair, and I do own a home in the city of Syracuse, and obviously this has affected my family. I am with the Families for the Lead Freedom Now, and we do have a concern. Loopholes allowing the landlords to not complete work to proper standards. And the problem with that is there are several points that allow landlords to pass substandard work off or to delay work for an unacceptable period. We want recommendation: do not allow inspectors to release properties when only interim controls are in place, and to require the replacement of interim controls in the case of inclement weather of over a week, and to remove the loopholes for abatement work done by landlord or unpaid family members. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So the next speaker is, I believe, Matricia Powell. Did I get that right?
Hi, I'm Matresa Powell.
Teresa Powell, excuse me.
I recently started working with the Democrat Socialists of America, and I found out just how bad the lead problem is in Syracuse, and I was absolutely shocked and really wanted to help out with doing something about that. So I'm really, really happy that this ordinance is now being brought up. One of our concerns is that the ordinance doesn't provide definitions for these key terms for commissioner, director, and department. It is a problem that could lead to legal challenges that defeat the lead ordinance in the court of law. So we think that it should be more clearly defined in section 54-4 and support the alternative 1 because we believe it is stronger than alternative 2. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is David Michael.
I'll be very brief. I must say, hearing this conversation of all the HUD requirements, I'm glad I'm retired. As some of you know, my wife, Peggy Liuzzi, has worked in early child care for about 4 decades, she tells me. And here's her, she can't come tonight, but here's her
Yes, you
comment.
can.
Thanks, David.
Yeah.
I'll be very, very brief. I think people in the audience and the report have described the problems of lead paint. We strongly support the lead paint ordinance, particularly alternative 1. As Peter Dunn of the Community Foundation said, this is the missing link in the efforts to combat lead. As you've heard, a lot of things are coming out, more funding, a lot of collaboration between the city and the county, and that's good. I'm also on the Board of Housing Visions, and their Syracuse projects also address the lead problem in some ways by building new homes, such as the Butternut Square project, and substantial gut rehabilitation of existing structures, such as the Winston Gaskin project on the north and east side of the city. They're also collaborating with the city and home headquarters and the mayor's new initiative to build 200 new homes. Our only caveat, and I think Councilor Malik referred to this, is it's important when you pass this ordinance that there be sufficient resources, staff and training to implement the ordinance. I think a couple people have said that. And I was encouraged to read in the paper that they're proposing 2 new inspectors, and I certainly hope when the council considers their budget, you will keep that in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. All right. Our next speaker is Peter Knobloch.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you folks. I'm a resident of Syracuse. I've been here for 60 years. 50 years ago, in my capacity as a child psychologist, I began evaluating children with documented high levels of lead. And as has been documented here today, their health and educational needs are extensive. I've continued to see these youngsters over the years, and the families struggle to find school programs and providers who recognize their needs. I'm fond of the notion of pay now or pay later, and so I appreciate your efforts to document and initiate the strongest possible initiative. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, Peter. Our next speaker is Mariana Kaufman.
Hello, thank you. My name is Mariana Kaufman. I'm a resident in Syracuse. I'm a physician. I'm a parent of two young children. I've sat on the boards of the CNY Solidarity Coalition and currently the Syracuse Peace Council. I'm active in several organizations that are concerned with social justice, and I have a particular interest in public health. I commend the council for taking this really important initiative to take a look at this preventable crisis and to give it the appropriate concern that it deserves. I strongly support the ordinance, and I strongly support Alternative 1. I do have, in reading through the ordinance, I do have one concern about the definition of what is considered permanent. The bill defines its goal is to create permanent protection from lead. The removal of the lead can be considered permanent, but encapsulating the lead with paint should not be considered permanent, and especially paint that encapsulates the lead on exterior surfaces in Syracuse is not going to be permanent. It's not going to last 20 years. It might last several years, especially on outside surfaces. So the recommendation would be to redefine permanent as lead remediation, the permanent removal of walls or soil-bearing lead paint, and that we should define encapsulation as abatement. And so the language should be changed that encapsulation should be continued to be inspected on a regular basis. Thank you.
Excellent point, Miranda. And please submit that in writing as well. We appreciate it.
I will. Thanks.
Thank you. Please submit that by email. Thank you. Our next speaker is Crystal Constantino.
Crystal Cosentino, I work for Home Headquarters as the Deputy Director, and thanks for the opportunity to speak tonight. Home Headquarters has been committed to creating, preserving, and financing healthy housing since we opened our doors back in 1996. As a community development financial institution, we have often financed home improvements that not only improve the quality of housing, a new roof, repaired sewer, new furnace, but also that improves occupant health. In 2015, with the Community Foundation and many community partners, many of them here tonight, we embarked on the creation of Green and Healthy Homes Initiative of Greater Syracuse, a national model focused on coordination, collaboration, and a single stream intervention process to address green, health, and safety issues in the home. Our city here, our county, and 9 other partners signed a compact committed to this work. In 2017, Home Headquarters and the Green and Healthy Homes Initiative facilitated several meetings to develop a prioritized approach to prevent lead poisoning. Our vision was to see a decrease in lead hazards in the built environment and a decrease in the number of children with elevated blood lead levels. While ambitious, we knew this would be attainable. It contained 4 focus areas: policy and enforcement, the built environment, health and medical, community awareness, and education. Many activities are underway today to address lead and its impacts. The approach is multifaceted and comprehensive, and we are beginning to see real impacts from our activities. The nearly 300-page draft environmental impact statement outlines in detail the need for this, from understanding how lead, even in small quantities, is impacting children in our community through data contributed by the local health department to a scan of housing conditions here in the city. Currently, we have a reactionary system. A child is poisoned, and then we mobilize. Wouldn't a system where we address lead before it becomes a problem be far better a way of handling things? It would reduce stress, health, and economic impacts caused by lead poisoning. We echo others like the Community Foundation who have already shared in other venues that an ordinance such as this will help us remain vigilant, proactive, and collaborative. The city's efforts through this draft lead ordinance will comprehensively improve housing quality and resident health. Home Headquarters is in support of the city of amending its property conservation code to include addressing and correcting the presence of deteriorated lead-based paint, and we appreciate this public meeting to learn more, and we expect to submit written comments later. Thank you.
Thank you, Krista. And I would just like to thank Green and Healthy Homes Initiative for all the work they've done, and your colleague Katie Bronson, who is another person who worked so long on this issue and is now in a different position, but she needs to be commended as well. Up next is Bobby Carroll, and then at the suggestion of my bright counselor, colleague, Counselor Green, on deck is Mary Cunningham. So first, Bobby Carroll from DSA, and on deck, Mary Cunningham.
Hi, my name is Bobby Carroll. I just moved here in August. I rent here in Syracuse. One thing about that I wasn't aware of is that there isn't like an online place you can look up where there's lead poisoning in certain properties or whatever, that you have to go to a physical building to do that. So for me, coming out of state, that's kind of a burden. I'm sure other people have an issue with that. It might be nice to know, like, if not only the unit you're trying to rent from, but the entire property has a bunch of issues with that. That'd be nice to have that sort of transparency in an online database instead of a physical building. So I just wanted to bring that point up, and then I wanted to reiterate that alternative 1 is what should be considered, since that's the stronger option for the ordinance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Carroll. Up next, we have Mary Cunningham, and on deck we have Evan Brozatowski.
Hi. Thank you for doing this. I mostly agree with Mariana Kaufman, who was talking about, I lived in Syracuse in a 1940 house for 30 years, a 1920 house for 13 years. The idea of encapsulating the outside paint is wishful thinking for 20 years. I know what what it does to take care of a house, and so I want to stress to you that we really need to make it maybe what is suggested possibly is every 6 years, but certainly it needs to stay under regular supervision and not just be pushed under the bridge. One of the things we know is that lead poisoning, we can only identify it in young children, but it lasts their whole lives, and it affects them and their families and our community. That we are looking at not 418 or 468 children in a year, it's over 22 years, it's over many years that we are accumulating. We have a huge number of children, a really incredible number of children who are affected their whole lives, and the expense their family and we as a community could be ameliorated if we would take care of it and spend the money now and push for the county, put in more money. There is more money there. It should be more than $3.5 million. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Up next, Evan Brozatowski. On deck, Nathan Courier. Is Evan here? Yep, there you are.
Hello, I thank you for welcoming me up. I'm Evan Brozatowski. I'm a member of American Iron Front. We are a group of independent anti-fascists that are in the area. And I wasn't really planning on coming up here today, but it really caught my attention. And to me, it just kind of seems like a no-brainer, to be perfectly honest. As the professor over there said that this has been going on, and the last study was in 1998. I was born in 1998, so this is something that's been going on since, I was just little me down here, And sorry if I'm a little scared. It's my first time being up here. Personally, this should be put through, and number one should be put through especially as well. So that's my personal opinion. Thank you for letting me come up here. Thank you.
Thank you. And for the record, I was born in '79, the first year that lead was outlawed, and yeah, it's been a problem my whole life as well, and I'm double your age. So, Nathan Courier.
Hi, thanks for letting me come up here and speak. So, my name's Nathan Courier. I'm a student at OCC, part of American Iron Front and the SRA as well. So, what I wanted to speak on was the tenants' rights issue. If there's any sort of legislation or bill that goes through involving this, tenants and even workers' rights, the people that have to deal with like the lead paint removal, should be of one of the utmost priorities. I remember one of the councilmen brought up that one of the tenants and the landlords pretty much being screwed out with the tenants not being able to receive any sort of help or aid due to that. And that should almost be criminal, as someone is actively participating in the harm of others while knowingly through these studies of like the information of what lead can do to everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mary Traynor is up next, and on deck we have Greg Smith. Mary Traynor and then Greg Smith.
Hi, I'm Mary Traynor. I'm here on behalf of the Syracuse Tenants Union. I'm also an attorney with the Legal Services of Central New York. And I was at the committee meeting this afternoon, which really had no surprises, and I just really think we need to focus on the enforcement mechanisms here. Our code enforcement department, well-intentioned as it may be, is really failing this city in a big way. The rental registry has not really worked the way it was intended to. I think that it could be amended in many ways just to improve enforcement. And we need to get serious about fines. All these programs seem to be reactive, right? They're triggered by a little child being poisoned. Mm-hmm. And then the big thing is, how do we get the landlords to accept our public funds, our money, okay? And if they don't do it, what happens? Nothing. So we really need to look at that part, because if we're not going to follow through, excuse me, and make sure that these buildings and the apartments are fixed, the tenants will be evicted. There's no protection from that, so they will be just, one family will move out, another family will move in, and nothing will change. And if problems, I believe you said you had about 76 applications and 70 were not completed. So that's not working. That's not working, and I would hope that there is right now a plan to fix that, like I would hope Codes has a plan to actually fix these things instead of just, continuing business as usual, excuse me, year after year. So thank you for doing this. I remember, Joe, years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, you first started talking about lead, and here we are considering an ordinance. So it's a huge improvement. I want to thank you for that.
Thank you, Mary. Greg Smith. Up next on deck, we have Stephanie Knifick.
I'd like to talk about the dust wipes. Ms. Lewis used the term investigation in finding what was the source of a problem, and this is key. It's very much a forensic sort of thing. I've worked. I'm a landlord, and incidentally, my family, my crew, and I have been working in the West Side on a daily basis for 40 years, providing safe housing. But anyway, you have to find what the vector is, how the lead gets into the kid. Now, dust on the floor, little kids crawl around a dirty floor, get dirty hands, put dirty hands and dirty toys in their mouth. That's pretty simple. But how did the lead get on the floor? Now, as far as the dust wipes go, I think we need to differentiate between lead from an environmental source and lead from the structural source. Now, if you have deteriorated lead, any kind of a violation, or you've done any kind of renovation work, yes, that falls completely on the owner. He owns the problem. It's your obligation to prove that you've done everything right and that you've cleaned it up. But if you get a case where there's no visible deterioration, there's no, say for example, you've got a place that's been abated, and it has a dust wipe that fails. Well, clearly the dust was tracked in. Now, Home Headquarters has a very informative video, and one of the things that they recommend for people to protect their kids is simply take your shoes off at the door, because there's a legacy of lead in our environment from leaded gasoline that was around for years. And virtually all dirt has a certain percentage of lead in it. So the lead that gets tracked in, yes, this is an issue. It's essentially, though, a housekeeping issue. And the reason that I feel we need to distinguish this is one, I don't view housekeeping as within the scope of the services we provide, and I don't think any landlord does either. If we make this something that the landlord is responsible for, the protocol will be that every 3 years somebody goes in with a mop right ahead of the guy with the dust wipe and wipes it up, and you get a dust wipe and it passes. Think back to when you were cramming on the last exam you took. Do you remember any of that stuff? No. And that's exactly the analogy here. What you've got is every 3 years you've got a very sterile surface that passes the test, but we don't address the ongoing problem. Now, we're patterning our...
We're at time, Mr. Smith, whenever you wrap up.
Real quick. Okay. Yeah, we're patterning this after the law in Rochester, which was very successful in lowering high lead levels, but actually not so much on low lead levels. So they have an okay program, but you know what? Okay is not okay. If we're going to solve this problem, everyone needs to work together. And what we need to do, we're going to be losing a teaching opportunity if we convey the impression that these housekeeping things that are critically important to reducing levels are the landlord's issue. We need to use this opportunity to get the parents involved in protecting the children also. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. Up next, Stephanie Knifick. On deck, we have, I believe his name is Rich Bachowski, who's in the house. Stephanie?
Hi there, I'm Stephanie Kenefick. I'm a resident of Syracuse. I'm a teacher, and I am also a member of the Syracuse Party for Socialism and Liberation. I want to really echo and amplify what Comrade Bobby Carroll mentioned about the transparency of lead poisoning and abatement. Currently, records are public, but only to those who can visit the office in person during business hours. As a teacher, I know very well that information is not truly public until it is freely accessible to all. That means digitally and available in multiple languages. The Party for Socialism and Liberation that I represent has experience in our neighboring town of Geneva, New York, addressing lead contamination in homes. We know well the painful realization that families in contaminated housing may face, that their homes can be poisoning them. It's the city's responsibility to ensure that families have all the necessary information in order to confront that terrible reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Mr. Pachowski's up next, and Brendan Brooks is on deck. Rich, I was nervous when I didn't see your name. You're at the back of the queue. What's going on?
I didn't write that down there. All right. Rich Pachowski, Executive Director, Syracuse United Neighbors. Been around for 42 years, active on the south, near west side, Skunk City neighborhoods, where the highest concentration of lead houses are located. You know, it's kind of interesting to show up here at noon, getting blocked out from speaking on council business, now coming back and everybody has a lot of food for thought for the counselors. Do we thank Counselor Driscoll, or did I get just lucky? You know, the council office has money. I see the budget. It's too bad about 100 copies of the ordinance wasn't on the table, Mr. Driscoll.
Fair point, Rich.
You know, it's too bad. Is it in the libraries?
It is available online on the website, but...
I said the libraries.
Yes.
All right.
Not yet, Rich.
2, you know, I understand the ordinance doesn't have the strictest federal EPA lead levels in the ordinance. Put it in there. 3rd, you know, after today, the dust will settle. It'll probably be a lot of lead dust. And where are we going? You know, is the energy going to transform to the neighborhoods on the south and near west side, for example? I want to see a public relations budget and an outline of what you're going to do. You know, it's kind of interesting. Sometimes you see banners downtown. Well, what about banners in the neighborhoods that talk about this? You know, once upon a time I got lucky and I got on the police van. That's a pretty expensive piece of taxpayers' money in the police van. Why not a lead van that rolls around in the neighborhood, stops maybe a couple of workers that live in that neighborhood, that does outreach, and come on and see what the lead fight is all about.
Thanks, Mr. Pachowski. Your time.
I ain't done.
Your time.
You don't cut out Rich Pachowski.
If you can wrap it up, I know we don't cut
you know,
you
I
off
mean,
here.
Counselor Hudson might do that, but not you. You know, I want to see a budget.
Counselor Hudson.
I want to see flyers. You know.
President Hudson.
Anyway.
It's my meeting, all right.
And my last point.
Okay, there you go, Rich.
Since you guys
We can
don't do
compromise.
anything, if you got landlords that don't comply, send their name and address to the Sun office, 1540 South Salina Street, because this is enough. This is criminal what these landlords are doing.
Thank you, Mr. Pachowski. Up next, our next speaker is Brendan Brooks, and on deck, our last speaker is Mr. Peter King. If anybody else would like to sign up, sign up now or forever hold your peace. Amanda, do you still have? We're done? We're closed? I misspoke. All right, so it's Brendan Brooks and then Peter King. Thank you.
Hey, I'm Brandon Brooks, Fifth Faith LLC. I'm hoping to move to the south side relatively soon here. One of the things that with the numbers, $3.5 million, just looking at some of the data, like you're talking about addressing, on average, about 3% of the homes that are possibly affected. And we're only, if you don't have 70 of the 76 in full, I mean, if we don't get the money committed, I don't know how that works. I mean, I'm a big proponent of supply and demand. If you show the work, you can go ahead and get more funding. So that's something I would really, I mean, if we canvass neighborhoods to get votes, if we go to the DSS and they have voter registrations on back of packets, if we know that there is a correlation between poverty and this issue, that's a hit list right there. People that are on Section 8, people that are getting these services. Let's get out there and let's be proactive about it. That's all I got.
Thank you, Brendan. Peter King.
Good evening, councilors. I actually, from what I've read of the document and from what I understand from what I hear, I completely approve of this as a first step. I think it's an excellent step, long needed in Syracuse, and I think also the comments made today also are very good at strengthening this document. The one thing I might say, also I am a Syracuse resident, is that a lot of the problems that seem to become, or the potential problem points relate to what's called in the literature your exposome, how an individual might come to be cumulatively affected by lead. And so these are all kinds of sources. There is literature specifically about Syracuse and about, for example, the soils, vacant lots. There's actually a number of ways that could happen. And so just in the sense of a liability, maybe to be aware of that literature, but also as in forward thinking, why stop with just the housing? There's a lot of potential for remediating the soils. There's actually ways to remediate soils that have been done in places like New Orleans and also in Norway and other countries. This is a worldwide problem. The one concept which could be pursued is braiding funding, so that you have HUD funding, you have other kinds of funding, so that you get funding from different sources and you mix different programs where applicable. And so thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. I believe President Hudson had a few remarks she wanted to make, and if any of my other councilors would like to make any closing remarks, feel free.
I do. First, I want to say thank you to everybody that's in attendance and thank you to everybody at the table. And I'm hoping that we can take some of the suggestions, because full disclosure, I was a 29-year-old woman when I bought my house on the south side. I lived in my house for 30 years. I sold my house in 2016, I think I did. And up until that point, I had a child that lived there with me, and I wondered why he was having all of these behavioral problems. You know why? I lived in a house for 30 years full of lead. No one ever told me that until I sold this property. So I think that it's better to start educating the younger buyers before they buy these homes, before their children are affected, because I've seen it with my own eyes. I see it happening. So I just want to let you know you're preaching to the choir, because I'm part of that issue. So I do hear you, and I appreciate everybody coming out and giving us your information and your, part of the process.
Thank you. And I want to give my gratitude to President Hudson, because when I started running for council, she was, waving the flag on this issue, and she's been a champion on it for many years, and it's great to have my fellow councilors working with me on this. Any other comments from the council? Anybody? Okay, thank you. I want to thank everyone for the comments. Please know that we'd like them submitted written as well. And to some of the suggestions that were made, I'd like to say my door is open, jdriscoll@seargov.net. I see government as us all working together, so some of those ideas about following up on concepts of things we could do better, I hope we can work together on them. Thanks everyone for attending.